Welcome back to Dwarves and Dice. This is the actually mathematically correct crits. Do you want max crit chance, max crit damage, best classes, best feats, and a build to mathematically max the damage? Well, you're in the right place. Let's start with crit chance. So you crit when you roll a 20 on the d20, which is a 1 in 20 or a 5% chance. When you have advantage, this goes up to 9.75, which is approximately double. To max the crit chance, early game you can take Champion Fighter and Elixir of Viciousness. This gives you plus 2 in total, so you crit on an 18, 19 or 20, so 15% or 28% with advantage. In late game you can take Deadshot, which is a bow. Even though the bow is in your range slot, it still gives you the plus 1, and Sarevok's Horned Helmet. Overall, now you can get plus 4 by late game, so a 16 through 20, 25% or 44% with advantage. The absolute max crit chance in the late game is taking the 4 from before, plus Bloodthirst and Knife of the Undermountain King, which are 2 daggers. Total you get plus 6, so between a 14 and a 20 with the crit, 35% or a whopping 58% with advantage. Look at increasing crit damage. Take your race as Half-Orc. This gives you Savage Attacks, which is plus 1 crit damage dice. In my opinion, this makes it the best race. Looking at a 1d8 weapon, which does 4.5 damage, you deal 4.5 times 2, which is 9, plus 9 from the proficiency and ability modifier, plus the additional crit dice, so this takes it up to 27. For a 2d6 weapon, on average you're doing 7 damage, but you're only going to be adding one of the d6, so you only get plus 3.5 damage times 2 because it's a crit. So 14 plus 9 plus the 3.5 on crit, 30 damage in total. As you can see, 30 damage is still bigger than 27, but when you start adding additional crit dice from Savage Attacker and a Barbarian level 9 Brutal Critical, you see that the 1d8 comes out ahead of the 2d6 because you're adding a larger dice each time. The story gets a little bit more interesting when you consider a 1d12 weapon as well. As you can see, the 1d12 weapon comes well out in front when it comes to raw damage on that crit. 70 damage, which second place is going to be 55 damage when it only has plus 2 critical dice. The builds are a Barbarian level 9 and a Fighter level 3 for the back row of plus 3, because that's the only way you can get it. And plus 2, plus 1 and plus 0 are all from a Warlock, Fighter, Rogue build, so that you have the most amount of crit, while also having the most amount of attacks. Although the story gets a little bit more interesting when looking at the damage per turn and not just on the crit. The plus 3 does have the biggest crit, but the plus 2 with the 1d12 actually catches up quite a lot because you get a lot more attacks per turn and a lot more chances to crit than if you're doing the plus 3 where you only get 2 attacks instead of plus 3 attacks. As you can see, 1d8 and 2d6 are well behind the 1d12 weapon, so in general I'll be considering a 1d12 weapon going forward. Also going forward, I'd like to hit 1,000 subscribers, so if you like this kind of content, please subscribe because there'll be a lot more to come. Now let's move on to feats. This is weapon dependent, so if you're going a dual wielding build, you're going to go dual wielder to get the additional damage on your offhand, and if you're going a two-handed weapon, you're going to go great weapon master, so you reroll a 1 or a 2 on your damage roll. No matter what you go, you're going to go savage attacks, because this gives you an extra crit dice. Now which one you go first, I had a look into this. You should go Savage Attacks first because you get the most damage out of that. I compared this to a level 5 fighter so you could see what would happen when you had a decent amount of crit chance. Early on in the game, you definitely want to go Savage Attacks first. How is the damage actually calculated? So you've got 3 different types of damage in the game: damage sources, damage riders, and damage riders that are treated as damage sources. So the total damage is a DS plus DR plus DRS plus DRs times the number of the DRSs. So damage sources are just the damage from your weapon or spell. This can be affected by crit. A damage rider is just additional damage applied on top of your DS or DRS. This is not affected by crit. DRS is where things get special though. This is like an additional damage like the DR, but it gets treated like your DS so it can crit and also procs more DR. For example, DR can be a Barbarian Rage, so you'll just get a plus 2 every time you attack. A DRS, however, could be a Sneak Attack, which is only reaction only, we'll come to that in a minute, which is a 1d6 per 2 levels, and that can crit. On top of that, this would proc your Barbarian plus 2 damage. Okay, let's get into classes. For Barbarian, you get Rage or Frenzy, which gives you additional hit chance, which translates into additional crit chance. It also gives you the small damage rider of plus 2 or plus 3 later on. For Fighter, you get Champion, which gives you additional crit chance. For Paladin, you get Divine Smite for additional crit damage. Divine Smite is a DRS, so it will also crit. Ranger Hunter gives you Colossus Slayer, which is also a DRS. Rogue also gives you a DRS, which is the sneak attack, but also has great synergy with Dual Wielder. This gives you an additional bonus attack, so you can use an additional offhand attack. For Warlock, you've got Hexblade, which gives you an additional attack on top of your extra martial attack, so you get 3 attacks per turn. Now there is a caveat with Divine Smite and Sneak Attack. you need to go into the reactions menu by pressing K and turn on Ask on Critical Hit. This will save you spell slots with the Divine Smite, and Sneak Attack is only treated as a damage rider until you do this. Once you do this, it's instead treated as a DRS. Therefore, you're going to get more damage out of it because it can then crit. Now let's get into the builds, the bit you've all been waiting for. For Race, go Half Orc. For your feats, go Savage Attacks, then either Great Weapon Master or Dual Wielder depending on your weapon. For weapons, we'll mainly be looking at 1d12. Dual Wielding has a special case which you'll see at the end, and Deadshot in your ranged weapon slot. Go Elixir of Viciousness for that additional crit chance, and for armour, go Saravox Horned Helmet. These are the 5 classes I'll be looking at. The first one is a Ranger, extra attack from the Warlock and the Ranger, plus the Divine Smite damage from Paladin. We've got Two-Handed Fighter, Hexblade Warlock, plus the Champion Fighter for extra crit chance, and then a Barbarian for the extra attack chance. For the next Two-Handed Fighter, we've got a level 6 fighter. This is to take advantage of the additional feat, plus a Ranger, plus Barbarian to try and maximise DRS and DR. For the Barbarian, we're trying to maximise the crit damage, so we've got a level 9 Barbarian and level 3 fighter with no additional class. This gives us plus 3 crit dice, so it will be dealing the most crit damage. For the final one, we've got a dual wielding build using Champion Fighter, Thief Rogue for the additional attacks, and Berserker Barbarian for the additional chance to hit. Each of the builds, I'm going to run through what each of them can give you, and then I'll run through how I calculated the damage. So for the first one, we're going to get an additional 2 attacks. We're going to get Hunter's Mark or Hex, depending on which one you use at the time. You can't use both because they're concentration spells. We've got Colossus Slayer for the additional 1d8 DRS, that's 1 time per turn, and the Divine Smite, which is a 1d8 DRS, which is only on crit. Finally, you've got your fighting style of Great Weapon Fighter. We do start with one of the more complex examples, but as we go through it, you'll see that it uses the exact same mathematics behind it. This one just happens to be a little bit more complex due to the Colossus Slayer and Divine Smite. But don't worry, I'll walk you through it. Okay, so to begin with, we've got a 20% crit chance. Our crit modifier is plus 2 crit dice, and the number of attacks is 3, plus 3 times the crit chance times the number of attacks. This is to take into account Great Weapon Master giving you an additional attack when you crit. Although Great Weapon Master does state that when you get a kill, you can also get an additional attack, this is just an approximation because it's too hard to take into account getting a kill. So therefore the number of procs for your damage riders equals the number of attacks plus the number of DRS. Here the number of procs is 3.6 from the number of attacks, plus 1 from the 1 time a turn that you get Colossus Slayer, plus 1 times the number of attacks times crit chance for the Divine Smite because that only procs on a crit. Total number of procs becomes 5.32. Total damage will become damage source plus damage riders treated as sources. Okay, now let's get into the calculation. For the damage source of a 1d12 weapon, you normally deal 6.5 damage. However, because you've got the Great Weapon Fighting, you deal 7.33 damage because you're re-rolling the 1s or 2s. The 6 comes from 2 times 3. The 2 is the fact that you've crit dealing double damage. The 3 is the 1 original 7.33 plus the next 2 crit modifying dice. Therefore, 2 times 3, 6. Times that by the crit chance, plus the 7.33 times the fact that you don't crit sometimes. The 0.05 takes into account that you will miss when you roll a 1. You times this all by the number of attacks, plus the number of attacks times crit because of the Great Weapon Master, and then at the end you add on the 9 times the number of attacks. The 9 coming from the proficiency modifier and the ability modifier. All in all, this takes you to 83.9 damage per turn. The damage rider from Hunter's Mark is 3.5 times the number of procs, here being 18.6. Finally, you've got your damage riders treated as damage sources. These are 1d8s, so 4.5 damage on average. So 4.5 times the fact that you won't crit, plus 4.5 times the modifier, times the crit chance. This is for the Colossus Slayer. The golden one is for Divine Smite, where it's 4.5 times the crit modifier, times the crit chance, times the number of attacks. All in all, giving you 28.2 damage. Adding this all together, you get 83.9 plus 18.6 plus 28.2, which gives you 130.7 damage per turn. If you have any questions or any comments, please let me know. Now let's move on to the second build, the Two-Handed Champion Fighter. This gives you plus 2 attacks, the fighting style of Great Weapon Fighting. Champion gives you extra crit chance, and Barbarian gives you rage for the advantage and 2 DR. Now I'm going to go through the calculation a little bit quicker, but it goes through the exact same steps as before, and I'll walk you through them. To start with, we've got 44% crit chance, a plus 2 damage modifier, and then we've got the number of attacks, which is the same 3 plus 3 times the crit chance times the number of attacks. Overall, number of procs, number of attacks plus DRS, which is 4.32 plus 0, 4.32. We've got the same total damage calculator, DS plus DR plus DRS. The damage here is the exact same calculation, however instead we've got a higher crit chance, so the damage source goes up to 121.98. For damage riders, we've got 2 times the number of procs, which is 8.6. No DRSs this time. Overall, 130.6 damage. If you'll notice, this is slightly lower than the one before, only by 0.1 damage per turn. On to the third build. We've got only 1 additional attack this time, with the fighting style of Great Weapon Fighting, Champion for the extra crit chance, Colossus Slayer gives us the 1d8 DRS, 1 time per turn, However, we do not get Hunter's Mark because Rage blocks us from using spells. Berserker gives us Frenzy, which gives us the advantage plus 2 DR, and the Frenzied Strikes. I want to mention just now that Frenzied Strikes I have not taken into account into any of the calculations, but know that when you're playing the build, if you do not hit a crit on your turn, you can use the bonus action for the Frenzied Strike to ensure that you get an additional attack on that turn. Okay, so here we've got a crit chance of 44% because of the Rage, crit modifier of plus 2, but the number of attacks has changed because you've only got plus 1 attack this time, so 2 plus 2 times the crit chance times the number of attacks, plus the DRS for the number of procs, which is 1 DRS per turn, up to 3.88 procs per turn. The same story as before, taking us to 81.32 damage per turn from damage source alone. This is lower than the one previous because we've got 1 less attack. Damage Riders in total, which is the Rage plus the Hunter's Mark, is 2 plus 4.5 times the number of procs, overall 25.2 damage per turn. No DRSs this time, so in total we get 106.5 damage per turn. This is quite a bit lower than the 2 previous builds. Now onto the two-handed Berserker Barbarian build, where we're trying to maximise the crit damage, however, you only get plus 1 attack. So we get additional crit damage dice, 3 in total. We've got Frenzy for advantage, plus 3 DR this time because you've got a level 9 Barbarian, and the Frenzy Strike as always. We've got Great Weapon Fighter, as well as Champion for the extra crit chance. We've got 44% crit chance, the plus 3 crit modifier, the number of attacks is 2 times the crit chance times the number of attacks. Number of procs therefore is 2.88 because we don't have any DRSs. So overall, damage sources is going to be a lot higher than usual, up at 96.82 because we've got the high crit chance and the high crit modifier, even although we've got less attacks per turn. Damage Riders is 3 times the number of procs, so 8.6 per turn. All in all, this gives us 105.4 damage per turn, which is even lower than build number 3. Told you there was a special build coming at the end? Well, here it is. The ultimate crit build with mega crit chance. This one's a little bit different, so I need to go through it step by step, but don't worry. To begin with, the weapons. We're going to be using Bloodthirst and Knife of the Undermountain King, both of which increase your crit chance, as well as having special features. Bloodthirst, when you attack with it, makes the target vulnerable to piercing damage. Knife of the Undermountain King gets additional damage by re-rolling damage dice when it's a 1 or 2. Your crit chance is up at a whopping 58%, which is 14% higher than all the other builds. You get the normal crit modifier of plus 2. Number of attacks is 4 from 2 main hand and 2 offhand. Number of procs is this 4, plus the number of DRS, which is 1, going to 5. So your first attack is normal. The 2 comes from the enchantment, plus 2.5 times the crit modifier times the crit chance, plus the chance to not crit. Your second attack, however, because it's now vulnerable, deals double damage on top of all of this. The Knife of the Undermountain King, for your offhand, also gets the additional damage, and instead of being 3.5 damage, is now at 3.67 damage from re-rolling the 1 and 2. The second attack from the Knife of the Undermountain King is the exact same. Now it's time to add up all the damage from the ultimate crit build. The first attack deals 11.625 damage, the next one 23.25, and then the Knife of the Undermountain King attacks is 32.2. This brings you to a 99.3 damage per turn, plus the ability modifier and proficiency times the number of attacks to 135.3 damage per turn from the damage source alone. You then need to add on Damage Riders. So you've got 2 times the number of procs of 5, which gives you 10. Then you've got to take into account the DRS of Sneak Attack, which is 7 times the chance that it will not crit, plus 3.5 times the crit modifier times the crit chance. The crit modifier here is slightly different than usual, but it does still work out to be the right number. Sneak Attack is 18.83. All in all, 135.3 plus 10 plus 18.8 brings your total to 164.1 damage per turn. That is insane. The first 2 builds were really close with only a 0.1 damage per turn difference. The next 2 builds really fell behind by about 25 damage compared to the first 2 builds, and fell behind by 60 damage compared to the last build. Now, although the last build really is the highest because of the vulnerability, 164 damage per turn is insane, with 60 or plus 30 damage compared to the other builds. That is so far in front of the other ones, it's not even close. I was really disappointed by the Barbarian that was trying to maximize the crit damage, because it actually came in last place. I really thought that it would come at least second, if not first. I then thought it would be really interesting to compare the total damage, normal damage, and crit chance of all the builds. For the first build, it has the highest crit damage, but it also has the lowest crit chance, so you're not really going to often see this average of 80. The next build is the lowest of the main builds. While it still has a 44% crit chance, 61 isn't really that high. For the third build, critting 44% of the time at almost 80, that is really impressive, although you only do get 2 attacks at this. For the Barbarian one that was trying to maximise crit damage, it isn't even first. and I'm really surprised at this. The damages do take into account DRS and DR, it would be unfair if you didn't do that, but I'm still surprised that it didn't come out in first, and this really shows that DRS and DR are what you really need to aim for to get the highest damage. Finally, with the last build for Bloodthirst and Knife of the Undermountain King, the chance to crit is insane. If you're critting an 80 on average, at 58%, that is insane. Knife of the Undermountain King is broken. Bloodthirst does bring it back a little bit, with the only 53 being the lowest, but still 80 damage on a crit, 58% of the time, brilliant. Also to note, the normal damage, the fighter of 2 attacks, with the high crit chance and the highest crit damage, actually has a really high normal damage as well. If you've learned something from this video, please hit the like button. Have a wonderful day. Bye bye.